Most people think of Babylon as nothing more than dusty ruins in a history book. We imagine an ancient empire along the Euphrates River, famous for its hanging gardens and its eventual military collapse. We read about it in the Old Testament as a political enemy of ancient Israel, a powerful kingdom that existed thousands of years ago, did its terrible damage, and then disappeared into the sands of modern-day Iraq. That is how history sees Babylon, but that is not how the Bible sees it. To the biblical writers, Babylon was never just a place on a map. It was an active, breathing spiritual threat. It was a dark architecture of human pride that refused to stay buried. It is the only city in Scripture that acts like a living antagonist. It is the ultimate rival to the city of God. If you trace the story from Genesis to Revelation, you will notice a strange and deliberate pattern. Babylon keeps coming back. It changes its borders. It changes its kings. Eventually, it even changes its name, but the spirit of the city remains exactly the same. It becomes the biblical shorthand for any human system that tries to build a name for itself, exploit the vulnerable, and redefine good and evil on its own terms. The entire Bible can actually be read as a tale of two cities. On one side, there is Jerusalem, the city of peace, the place where God chooses to dwell with his people. Jerusalem represents a kingdom built on covenant, justice, mercy, and total dependence on the Creator. It is the city that receives its identity as a gift from God. On the other side, there is Babylon, the city of human achievement, the place where humanity gathers to declare its own glory. Babylon represents a kingdom built on military power, economic exploitation, and absolute self-sufficiency. It is the city that tries to seize its identity from God. These two cities are locked in a cosmic collision that spans the entire biblical narrative. And what is fascinating is how carefully the biblical authors track the movement of this rival city. They do not treat Babylon merely as a temporary historical obstacle. They treat it as an archetype. Prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, exiles like Daniel, and apostles like Peter and John all recognized that the shadow of Babylon was always looming over the people of God. They understood a terrifying truth. You did not have to live in the ancient Middle East to be trapped inside Babylon. Babylon is the empire of the human ego. It is the belief that if we just gather enough resources, build enough technology, and consolidate enough power, we can reach the heavens and secure our own salvation. It is a system that always looks glittering and golden on the outside. It promises security. It promises prosperity. But the prophets saw straight through the gold. They saw a system that always ends up consuming the very people who build it. We tend to think the story of Babylon ended when the Medes and the Persians conquered it in the 6th century before Christ. But the Bible insists that Babylon never truly fell. It just relocated. The spirit of the city moved into the empire of Rome, and from Rome, it seeped into the empires, economies, and nations of the modern world. The biblical warning is not just that Babylon existed in the past. The warning is that Babylon is still here. It is a profound and terrifying pattern. But to understand how this city became the ultimate symbol of human rebellion, to see why it becomes the final enemy destroyed at the end of the book of Revelation, we have to go back to the very beginning. We have to go back to the first time this city appears on the pages of Scripture. Because it does not begin as a global empire. It does not begin with a king wearing gold. It begins on a flat plain, with a group of anxious people and a pile of bricks. The story begins in Genesis chapter 11. Humanity has migrated to a valley, a flat plain in the land of Shinar. And there, they discover a new piece of technology. They discover how to make bricks. To a modern reader, a brick is just an ordinary building material. But in the biblical imagination, the brick is a profound symbol of human control. Before this, if you wanted to build an altar or a monument, you had to find stones. You had to work with what the earth gave you. Stones are irregular. They are uneven. They require you to adapt to the material. But a brick is different. A brick is uniform. It is predictable. It is mass-produced. With bricks, you do not have to wait for nature or depend on the environment. You can manufacture your own reality. Notice what the people say in Genesis chapter 11, verse 3. Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. And then, verse 4. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. That is the founding philosophy of this city. It is the belief that with enough human ingenuity, With enough uniform technology, humanity can engineer its own security. We do not need to depend on the Creator. We can build our own way up to the divine. We can make a name for ourselves. This was in direct defiance of what God had commanded humanity to do. In the opening pages of Genesis, God told humans to multiply and fill the earth, to spread out, explore, and cultivate the world. But the builders in Genesis 11 do the opposite. They centralize. They consolidate. They gather in one place to build a towering monument to their own glory, motivated by a deep fear of being scattered. And this is where we discover a detail that English translations often obscure. In English, we call this the Tower of Babel. But later in the Old Testament, we read about the massive empire of Babylon. In our minds, those are two completely different words, two different places. But in the original Hebrew text, they are the exact same word, Babel. The ancient readers did not see a separation between the unfinished tower in Genesis and the terrifying empire that would eventually burn down their temple. To them, it was the exact same city, the same spirit, the same ancient rebellion returning in a new era. The people who built the tower thought they were doing something glorious. In their own ancient language, the word for their city meant the gate of the gods. They thought they were constructing a portal to heaven, but God comes down, looks at their tower, and turns their pride into a permanent warning. In Hebrew, the word Babel sounds like the word for confusion. What humanity called the gate of heaven, Scripture calls a confused, chaotic mess. God does not destroy the tower with an earthquake or fire. He simply confuses their language. Because a unified human rebellion, armed with the power to manufacture its own reality, is ultimately a danger to itself. When humans can no longer understand each other, the system breaks down, the building stops, and the people are scattered. It looks like a permanent defeat. The bricks are left in the dirt. The tower is abandoned. The first attempt at a human-centered empire collapses before it can reach the sky. The tower was stopped, and the people were scattered. But the spirit of Babel did not die in the desert. It just waited. Hundreds of years later, those bricks would be picked up again. The city would rise from the dust to become the darkest nightmare Israel ever faced. For centuries, the unfinished tower sat quietly in the dust. While the ruins of Babel faded into the desert, God began a completely different project. He called a man named Abraham. He formed a new people. He gave them a land. And eventually, he established a city, Jerusalem. Jerusalem was designed to be the exact opposite of Babel. Babel was built on human pride. Jerusalem was supposed to be built on divine covenant. Babel was an attempt by humans to force their way up to heaven. In Jerusalem, heaven freely came down to dwell among humans in the sanctuary of the temple. Babel was obsessed with making a name for itself. Jerusalem was meant to bear the name of God for the sake of the surrounding nations. For generations, Israel lived in the tension of this calling. But over time, the kings of Israel stopped trusting God. They started relying on military alliances. They began accumulating wealth at the expense of the vulnerable. They started worshiping the idols of their neighbors. Slowly, the city of God began to act exactly like the empires of men. And while Jerusalem was losing its identity, the ancient spirit of Shinar was waking up. In the late 7th century before Christ, a new king came to power. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. He did not just rebuild the ancient city of Babylon, he turned it into a golden masterpiece. He built massive walls that seemed impenetrable. He constructed the famous Ishtar Gate, covered in brilliant blue tiles and images of dragons and lions. He commanded an army that swept across the ancient Near East like a terrifying flood. The scattered bricks of Genesis chapter 11 had been gathered again, but this time, they were not just a tower. They formed a massive, highly organized, unstoppable machine. And in the year 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar marched that machine to the gates of Jerusalem. This is one of the most traumatic moments in the entire biblical narrative. We read about it in 2 Kings chapter 25 and 2 Chronicles chapter 36. It was not a quick battle. It was a brutal, suffocating siege. When the walls finally broke, the Babylonian army did not just defeat Israel. They dismantled Israel's reality. They burned the royal palace. They tore down the city walls. And most devastating of all, they destroyed the temple. The dwelling place of God was reduced to ashes. The sacred vessels were stripped from the sanctuary and carried away as trophies. For the ancient Israelites, this was not just a military defeat, it was a theological collapse. In the ancient world, when one nation defeated another, the assumption was simple. The gods of the winning nation were stronger than the gods of the losing nation. To the watching world, it looked like the gods of Babylon had conquered the God of Israel. It looked like the city of human pride had finally crushed the city of divine peace. But Nebuchadnezzar was not finished. He did not just destroy Jerusalem. He took the brightest, the youngest, and the most skilled people of Judah, and he dragged them away into exile. But look closely at where they were taken. They were not just moved to a random foreign country. They were marched hundreds of miles across the desert, back to the plains of Shinar, back to the valley where humanity had first decided to manufacture its own reality, back to the exact place where the Tower of Babel had been built. The biblical writers want us to feel the heavy irony of this moment. The children of Abraham had been dragged all the way back to the starting line of human rebellion. Jerusalem was burned, the temple was gone, and the people were dragged back to the very place where the Tower of Babel had been built, which led to the most painful theological question in the Old Testament. When the Israelites arrived in Babylon, they were completely overwhelmed. If you were a young exile walking through the massive gates of the city, you would have looked up at walls that were so thick, ancient historians claimed chariots could race along the top of them. You would have seen a sprawling metropolis. You would have seen hanging gardens. And at the center of the city, you would have seen a massive ziggurat, a stepped pyramid reaching up to the sky, perfectly mirroring the ancient Tower of Genesis chapter 11. Every piece of architecture in Babylon was designed to send a single psychological message. Babylon is eternal. Babylon is supreme. Your God has failed. This was the true danger of the exile. The goal of the Babylonian Empire was not just to defeat people militarily. The goal was assimilation. The empire wanted to erase your history, change your language, alter your education, and absorb you into its machinery. They wanted you to look at the golden statues, the wealth of the markets, and the power of the king, and slowly decide that the God of Israel was no longer worth remembering. We have a rare window into the raw emotional trauma of this exact moment. It is recorded in Psalm 137. It begins with one of the most heartbreaking images in all of Scripture. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. Zion was another name for Jerusalem. The exiles are sitting by the irrigation canals of the empire, surrounded by the greatest economic and military machine in the world, and they are weeping. They take their harps, the instruments they once used to worship God in the sanctuary of the temple, and they hang them on the branches of the willow trees. They refuse to play. Then the text says that their captors came to them and demanded entertainment. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. This was not a polite request for cultural music. It was the ultimate humiliation. The Babylonians wanted the Israelites to take the sacred covenant worship of the Creator and turn it into background music for the empire. They wanted to consume Israel's theology as a trophy. And the exiles respond with a haunting question. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? This is not just a historical question. It becomes one of the most important theological questions in the entire Bible. How do you remain faithful when the system around you is built on pride and power? How do you hold on to your identity when the empire demands that you worship its image? How do you live in Babylon? For many of the exiles, the spiritual crisis was too heavy. They assumed that God was confined to the physical temple in Jerusalem. And since the temple was gone, they believed God was gone. Others simply gave in. They stopped weeping by the rivers. They learned the Babylonian language, adopted the Babylonian gods, and let the empire swallow them whole. They became just another brick in the wall. It seemed like Babylon had won. The empire had crushed the city of God. It had burned the sanctuary. It had silenced the songs of Zion. It looked like the ancient rebellion of Shinar had finally defeated the covenant of God. But inside the belly of the empire, something unexpected was happening. A few young men from Jerusalem were about to show the world that Babylon was not as powerful as it looked. They were about to demonstrate how to live in Babylon, without letting Babylon live in them. When the Babylonians took the brightest young men of Judah into exile, they did not put them in prison. They put them in the royal academy. This was the empire's most effective weapon. It was not just military force. It was cultural assimilation. We see this unfold in the opening pages of the book of Daniel. 4 young Jewish men, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, are brought into the king's palace, and the empire immediately goes to work on their identity. They are taught the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. They are offered the royal food and wine, and most importantly, their names are changed. In Hebrew, their birth names all contain the name of the true God, but their new Babylonian names, Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were tied to the false gods of Babylon. The empire wanted to reprogram how these young men saw the world. This is the subtle danger of Babylon. It does not always come with swords. Sometimes it comes with comfort. It offers security, status, and education, as long as you are willing to forget who you really are. But Daniel and his friends do something entirely unexpected. They do not start a violent rebellion. They do not isolate themselves in the desert. They stay. They learn the language. They study the literature. They actually enter the civil service of the Babylonian government, but they draw a quiet, immovable line. It starts in chapter 1 with something as simple as food. Daniel refuses to eat the royal diet. That sounds small. It is not. It was a physical, daily reminder that his ultimate dependence was not on the king of Babylon, but on the God of Israel. As the story progresses, the empire demands more than just cultural assimilation. It demands worship. In Daniel chapter 3, King Nebuchadnezzar builds a massive golden statue on the plain of Dura. Notice the location: a flat plain in the region of Babylon. It is the exact same geography as the Tower of Genesis chapter 11, and the command is exactly the same. Bow down to this monument of human achievement. Worship the image of the empire. Recognize human power as the ultimate authority in the universe. It is the spirit of Babel returning with terrifying force. But 3 young men refuse. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stand up while the rest of the world bows down. They are thrown into a blazing furnace, but the fire does not consume them, because the God of Jerusalem is present, even in the fires of Babylon. Later, in Daniel chapter 6, under a new king, the empire makes another absolute demand. No one can pray to anyone except the king for 30 days. The empire always tries to take the place of God, but Daniel simply goes to his room, opens his window toward Jerusalem, and prays to the Creator. He is thrown into a den of lions, and again, the empire fails to consume him. This is the profound message of the book of Daniel. It is a spiritual survival guide. It teaches the people of God that you can live inside the machinery of Babylon. You can work in its cities. You can speak its language, but you must never give it your soul. You can serve the city, but you cannot worship the beast. Daniel survived the empire. He outlasted its kings. He proved that the God of Israel was not bound to a physical temple in Jerusalem. But while Daniel was subverting Babylon from the inside, the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah were seeing something deeper from the outside. They looked at the towering, golden walls of the city. They looked at its massive economy and its unstoppable military, and they saw a system that carried the seeds of its own destruction. While Daniel and his friends were navigating life inside the empire, the prophets of Israel were delivering a terrifying diagnosis from the outside. When the ancient world looked at Babylon, they saw an eternal city. They saw walls that could not be broken, military strength that could not be matched, and an economy that could not be drained. But when the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah looked at Babylon, they saw a fragile ruin. They knew that any system built on the exploitation of others and the exaltation of human pride is already collapsing, even if its walls are painted in gold. In Isaiah chapter 14, the prophet sings a taunting song over the king of Babylon. He describes the king as an arrogant ruler who says in his heart, "I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God." Notice the language. It is the exact same ambition as the builders of the original tower. It is the ancient obsession with climbing up, the desperate, violent need to manufacture your own glory and make a name for yourself. But Isaiah goes even deeper. In chapter 47, he exposes the true spiritual disease of the empire. He says that Babylon sits proudly on her throne and whispers in her heart, "I am, and there is none besides me." That sounds like a simple statement of political confidence. It is not. "I am" is the sacred, covenant name of the Creator. Babylon was not just conquering ancient nations. It was stealing the identity of God. It was demanding absolute allegiance and declaring itself the ultimate reality in the universe. Jeremiah saw the same spiritual sickness. In Jeremiah chapter 51, he describes Babylon as a golden cup that has made the whole earth drunk. The empire intoxicated the surrounding nations with its wealth, its luxury, and its military power. It consumed the vulnerable to build its own monuments. It created an entire global system built on human greed. But the prophets understood a fundamental law of the biblical universe. Whatever humans try to build up to heaven, God will eventually bring down to the dust. Isaiah and Jeremiah both predicted that the golden city would fall. They declared that God would eventually dismantle the machinery of Babylon. And in the year 539 BC, that is exactly what happened. A Persian king named Cyrus marched his army toward the great city. According to historical records, the Persians diverted the waters of the Euphrates River, marched directly under the massive, impenetrable walls, and took the city in a single night. The golden age of Babylon was over. The physical city was absorbed into a new empire. Over the next few centuries, it slowly decayed. Its walls crumbled. Its wealth was scattered. Its massive, stepped towers were abandoned to the desert winds. Eventually, Babylon became nothing more than a field of silent ruins in the sands of the Middle East. If you were reading history like a normal textbook, you would think the story ends there. The historical empire was defeated. The Israelite exiles were finally allowed to return home to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. The threat of Babylon was buried safely in the past. But remember the pattern. The ancient spirit of Shinar does not die in the dust. It just waits for a new host. The physical bricks might have crumbled, but the system of human pride is always looking for a new capital. Hundreds of years pass. The Old Testament closes. The ancient world changes hands from the Persians to the Greeks, and finally, to the massive, iron-crushing machinery of the Romans. And when we open the letters of the New Testament, the shadow of the city suddenly returns. By the time we reach the 1st century, the world has completely changed. The ancient empire of Babylon is long gone. Its massive walls are buried under the dirt. In its place stands a new superpower, Rome. Rome stretched from the shores of Britain to the deserts of Syria. It had built the most advanced system of roads, the most disciplined military, and the most robust economy the world had ever seen. The Roman emperors did not just see themselves as political rulers. They demanded to be treated as gods. They promised a global peace, as long as you bowed down and pledged your absolute allegiance to the state. For the early Christians, living in the Roman Empire was incredibly dangerous, because Christians claimed that Jesus was Lord, which meant Caesar was not. And this is where we find a fascinating and mysterious detail hidden at the very end of one of the New Testament letters. The Apostle Peter is writing a letter to scattered, suffering Christians across the Roman world. He is writing to encourage them, to tell them how to endure persecution, and how to stay faithful in a culture that hates them. And then, in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, he sends his final greetings. He writes, "She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings." At first glance, that sounds like Peter is writing from the physical region of Mesopotamia. It sounds like he is sitting in the ancient ruins of the Babylonian Empire. He is not. Historical tradition and early Christian writings strongly agree that Peter wrote this letter from the capital of the Roman Empire. He was in Rome. So why did he call it Babylon? Peter was not just using a random nickname. He was making a profound theological diagnosis. He was looking past the white marble columns, the golden eagles of the Roman legions, and the wealth of the empire. He was looking at the spiritual machinery underneath it all, and he realized exactly where he was. He was in Babel. He was in Shinar. He was standing in the exact same system of human pride that the prophets Isaiah and Jeremiah had warned about centuries earlier. This is where the pattern we have been tracking suddenly locks into place. Rome was doing exactly what ancient Babylon had done. It was centralizing power. It was building monuments to its own glory. It was consuming the vulnerable to feed its economy. It was demanding worship. And to make the parallel even more terrifying, just as Babylon destroyed the first temple in Jerusalem in the year 586 before Christ, Rome would go on to destroy the second temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. The physical bricks had changed, but the spirit of the empire was identical. By calling Rome Babylon, Peter was sending a coded, powerful message to the early church. He was telling them that they were the new exiles. In fact, he uses the word exiles in the very first verse of his letter. He was reminding them that no matter where they lived in the Roman Empire, they were living in foreign territory. They had to learn the lesson of Daniel all over again. They had to figure out how to live in Babylon, work in Babylon, and love their neighbors in Babylon, without ever bowing down to the golden image of the empire. Babylon had become the code word of the church. It was their way of recognizing that the ancient rivalry between the city of man and the city of God was still raging. Peter saw that Rome was just Babylon with a new name. But Peter only saw the shadow of what was coming. It was another apostle, an old man exiled on a rocky prison island, who saw the final, terrifying form this city would take. Peter saw the shadow of Babylon operating in the streets of Rome. But it was the apostle John who saw the final, terrifying form this ancient city would take. Toward the end of the 1st century, John was exiled by the Roman government to a small, rocky island called Patmos. There, he receives the apocalyptic vision that becomes the book of Revelation. And in chapters 17 and 18, the ancient enemy of Genesis chapter 11 returns for the last time. John sees a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. The beast is terrifying, representing the brutal military and political power of the empire. But the woman is beautiful. She is dressed in purple and scarlet, glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She holds a golden cup in her hand, and written across her forehead is a name, Babylon the Great. Notice how all the biblical imagery we have traced so far perfectly merges into this one vision. She holds the golden cup that Jeremiah warned about, the cup that makes the nations drunk with power and wealth. She sits on a system that demands worship, just like the golden statue of King Nebuchadnezzar. She promises that she will never fall, echoing the exact arrogance of the ancient city in Isaiah. John is not predicting that the literal, ancient city in the Middle East will be rebuilt with bricks. He is showing us the ultimate, final culmination of the Babel system. Throughout history, Babylon has always relied on two weapons: military violence and economic seduction. The beast forces you to bow, but the golden cup makes you want to bow. In chapter 18, John describes the terrifying economic machinery of this final Babylon. When the city begins to collapse under the judgment of God, the kings and the merchants of the earth stand at a distance and weep. They do not weep because they love the city. They weep because their profit machine is gone. John lists the cargo that flowed through the empire. It is a staggering list of luxury: gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble. It sounds like the inventory of a prosperous, thriving global economy. But then, at the very end of the list in verse 13, John slips in the darkest detail of all. He lists the final commodity traded by the empire: human beings sold as slaves. Literally, the Greek text says, "the bodies and souls of men." This is the ultimate unmasking of Babylon. From the plains of Shinar to the streets of Rome, the system of human pride always ends up treating human souls as commodities. It builds its towering achievements on the backs of the vulnerable. It trades the dignity of God's image bearers for the luxury of a few. To the world, Babylon looks like the pinnacle of human success. But heaven looks at the same system and calls it a monster. And just like the unfinished tower in Genesis, and just like the ancient ruins in the desert, John sees that this final global system is doomed. It carries the weight of its own destruction. In a single hour, its wealth is brought to ruin. The merchants weep. The music stops. The golden cup shatters. The Bible tells us that whatever humanity tries to build in arrogance without the Creator will eventually fall. John watches the ultimate empire collapse under its own weight. But hidden inside his vision of destruction is a single, urgent command from God to his people. And it is a command that echoes all the way down to us today. John watches the ultimate empire collapse. But right before the final judgment falls on Babylon, he hears a voice from heaven. And that voice shouts a single, urgent command to the people of God: "Come out of her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues." This is the climax of the entire biblical pattern. God is not telling his people to pack their physical bags and leave a specific city in the Middle East. By the time John writes his apocalyptic vision, Babylon is a spiritual reality that covers the earth. You cannot escape Babylon by crossing a physical border. To come out of her means something much deeper and much more difficult. It means removing your allegiance from the system of human pride. It means refusing to drink from the golden cup of the empire. It means looking at a culture that measures success by wealth, power, and the exploitation of others, and quietly saying, "I do not belong to this machinery." It is the exact same choice Daniel faced when he refused the king's food. It is the exact same choice the exiles faced when they hung their harps on the willow trees and refused to turn worship into entertainment for their captors. From the plains of Shinar, to the fiery furnace of Nebuchadnezzar, to the streets of Rome, the spirit of Babylon has always demanded the exact same thing. It demands your soul in exchange for its security. And the entire Bible, from the first pages to the last, is asking us to choose between two cities. On one side is the city of man. It always begins with a pile of bricks on a flat plain. It is the desperate, exhausting human attempt to build our way up to heaven, to manufacture our own security, and to make a name for ourselves. It looks like gold, but it always ends in confusion. On the other side is the city of God. At the very end of the book of Revelation, after the smoke of Babylon finally clears, John sees a completely different architecture. He sees the New Jerusalem, but notice how it appears. It is not built from the ground up. Humanity does not construct it with mass-produced bricks. John says he saw the holy city coming down out of heaven from God. Babylon is what humans try to build up to heaven. Jerusalem is what God freely brings down to earth. Babylon is an empire of grasping. Jerusalem is a kingdom of receiving. Babylon is built on the blood of the vulnerable. Jerusalem is built on the blood of the Lamb. We are all living in the tension between these two cities. Every day, in the way we spend our money, in the way we treat the people around us, and in the way we seek security, we are choosing which city we belong to. The shadow of Babel is still here. The empire will always offer you its golden cup. It will always promise you that if you just gather enough resources and build your own tower, you will finally be safe. But the prophets, the apostles, and the vision of John all stand as a unified warning. The tower will fall. The gold will rust. The empire will eventually consume itself. There is only one city that will last forever. And you do not have to build it. You only have to receive it. If this journey through the pattern of Babylon has helped you see Scripture with fresh eyes, subscribe so you do not miss the next deep dive into the biblical text. Babylon was never just an ancient ruin in the desert. It was the ultimate mirror of the human heart without God. And its destruction was never just a story of punishment. It was the final, merciful clearing of the ground, making way for a kingdom that cannot be shaken.